There are secrets that sleep in the bones of cities, secrets pressed between the marble columns of museums, whispered in the hushed galleries where masterpieces hang under perfect light. New York City holds thousands of them, but none quite like this one. Imagine walking past a sculpture every day. Your footsteps echo on polished floors. The marble catches afternoon light filtering through tall windows. You've seen this piece 100 times, maybe 1,000. But what you don't know, what no one knows, is that this very sculpture holds the key to a woman's disappearance, a calculated crime, and a secret so carefully buried that it would take 60 years to excavate. This is not a story about what was stolen. This is a story about what was found, and the human cost of keeping beauty locked away from the world. Let me take you back to 1961. Not the year of the crime. No, we're starting earlier, because to understand what happened, you need to understand the world that made it possible. The Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1961 wasn't just a building. It was a temple, a cathedral to human achievement where silence was sacred and every object had been touched by history itself. The air inside smelled of old wood and possibility. Visitors spoke in reverent whispers, as if raising their voices might shatter something priceless. Milton Brooks was 21 years old when he first walked through those doors as an employee. Not a visitor, not a guest, an employee. Think about that for a moment. Most people who worked at the Met in those days came from families with resources, connections, the right last names. Milton wasn't one of them. He'd grown up in a cramped apartment in Brooklyn, sharing a bedroom with two brothers. His father worked on the docks. His mother took in sewing. The closest thing to art in their home was a calendar from the local bank. But Milton had something that opened doors education alone couldn't. He understood the language of desire. He knew how to read people, how to become what they wanted to see. Charm, they called it. Though that word never quite captured the calculated nature of his gift. He started in the registration department, the unglamorous back end of museum work. Cataloging acquisitions, managing paperwork, tracking the endless documentation that turned objects into collection pieces. It was tedious work, the kind most people endured while dreaming of something better. Milton didn't endure it. He studied it. He learned every protocol, every weakness in the system. He memorized which guards chatted too long on their breaks, which curators grew careless with keys, which donors demanded attention that pulled staff away from their posts. The Met was a machine, and Milton learned to read its rhythms like a conductor reads a score. By 1965, he'd been promoted to assistant curator in the Greek and Roman department. 4 years after that, senior curator. The boy from Brooklyn had become a gatekeeper to antiquity itself. Everyone remarked on his dedication, how he'd arrive early, stay late, how he'd volunteer for inventory projects that took him into storage areas other curators found claustrophobic and dull, how he knew the collection better than people who'd worked there twice as long. Milton sees things others miss, his supervisor once wrote in a performance review. She had no idea how right she was. Here's what most people don't understand about museum theft. The hard part isn't getting in. Museums are designed to welcome thousands of people through their doors every day. Guards are trained to watch for suspicious behavior, yes, but they're watching visitors. The real vulnerability in any museum is the same as in any institution. It's the people who belong there, the ones with keys and access and the benefit of doubt. Milton spent 18 years building that access, 18 years becoming invisible in his visibility, someone so familiar that guards nodded to him without really seeing him, colleagues trusted him without really questioning why. The Hermes had arrived at the Met in 1957, acquired from a private European collection. 2nd century Roman marble about 2 feet tall, exquisite in its preservation. The god's face captured mid-thought, young and knowing at once, lips slightly parted as if about to speak some divine secret. It wasn't the most valuable piece in the collection, not by a long measure, but it was portable, self-contained, the kind of thing that could vanish into a carefully prepared crate without the immediate alarm that would follow a larger theft. Milton waited until 1979. Why wait so long? This is crucial to understanding him. A smash-and-grab thief acts on impulse, desperation, opportunity. Milton was building something else entirely. He was constructing an escape route so carefully integrated into his daily work that when he finally walked out of the Met with a piece of antiquity hidden in a conservation materials cart, it looked like nothing more than Milton being Milton, dedicated, trusted, staying late to transport materials to a restoration facility uptown. The theft happened on a Tuesday in January, cold enough that anyone moving quickly could blame it on the weather. The Hermes head was listed as in conservation in the records. It would be weeks before anyone thought to verify its actual location. By then, the trail would be frozen solid as the marble itself. But here's where Milton made his first mistake. He needed help. Donald McGregor was 63 years old in 1979. A small-time dealer in antiquities who operated out of a cramped office in the Diamond District. He knew buyers who didn't ask questions. He knew how to create provenance documents that looked authentic enough to pass casual inspection. He knew, in other words, how to make stolen beauty respectable. Milton had cultivated the relationship for 5 years before the theft, visiting Donald's office under the pretense of researching pieces for potential acquisition, building trust, building plausibility. What Milton didn't anticipate was Melissa Johnson, 22 years old, African-American, working as Donald McGregor's secretary to pay for night classes at Hunter College. She wanted to be a teacher, history maybe, or English literature. She'd grown up in Harlem, daughter of a postal worker and a nurse, first in her family to go to college. She was saving money, building a future, staying out of other people's business. Except, she couldn't stay out of this business because this business happened right in front of her. Melissa worked late on a Thursday evening in February, filing documents in Donald's back office. The door was open just enough. Voices carried. She heard Milton's voice, which she recognized from his previous visits. Always polite, always professional. And she heard Donald's voice, more animated than usual. Excited. She heard them discuss the Hermes head. She heard them discuss a buyer. She heard Donald mention a figure, $35,000. In 1979, $35,000 could buy a house. It could change a life. Melissa didn't mean to hear it, but once you've heard something like that, you can't unhear it. The knowledge sits in your stomach like a stone, growing heavier every day. She struggled with what to do for almost 2 weeks. This is important to understand. Melissa wasn't naive. She knew what happened to people who talked about things powerful people wanted kept quiet. She knew the risks of crossing men who dealt in stolen goods, especially as a young black woman in a city that didn't always value her safety. But she also knew that what she'd overheard was wrong, that somewhere someone had trusted these men with something precious, and that trust had been betrayed. On February 14, 1979, Valentine's Day, a detail that would later seem unbearably cruel, Melissa made an anonymous call to the Metropolitan Museum's security office. She didn't give her name, she didn't provide details about how she knew. She simply said that if they checked Donald McGregor's office at a specific address in the Diamond District, they'd find a stolen Hermes head from the Greek and Roman collection. The tip was specific enough to be credible. The police secured a warrant. They raided Donald's office that same afternoon. They found the Hermes head wrapped in velvet cloth inside a locked filing cabinet, along with forged documentation claiming it had been legally purchased from a private European estate. Donald McGregor was arrested. In the interrogation room, facing decades in prison, he gave up Milton Brooks within hours. Milton was arrested at the Met the following morning. The New York Times ran the story on page 3. Museum curator charged in antiquities theft. The art world was scandalized. How could someone entrusted with preservation become a thief? Colleagues described Milton as dedicated, knowledgeable, passionate about his work. The betrayal felt personal to everyone who'd worked alongside him. But here's what the newspapers didn't report. What the investigation didn't uncover for 60 years. Melissa Johnson never made it home that Valentine's Day night. Melissa's mother, Grace Johnson, reported her daughter missing on February 16th after Melissa failed to show up for a family dinner and didn't call, something Melissa would never do. The police took a missing persons report. They interviewed Melissa's friends, her professors, her neighbors. Everyone said the same thing. This wasn't like her. Melissa was responsible, reliable, always let people know where she was. But in 1979, the NYPD was stretched thin. The city was struggling with economic crisis, rising crime rates, institutional chaos. Missing persons cases, especially involving young adults, often got filed away with the assumption that people left of their own accord. Melissa had no history of mental illness, no apparent reason to disappear, but also no obvious evidence of foul play. The case went cold within weeks. Grace Johnson never stopped searching. She put up flyers, contacted local news stations, called the police every week for updates. She organized search parties through Harlem, walking the same streets over and over, hoping for some sign of her daughter. Years passed, then decades. Grace died in 2004, never knowing what happened to Melissa, never getting to say goodbye. The connection between Melissa's disappearance and the Hermes head theft was never made. Why would it be? The museum recovered the sculpture. Milton Brooks and Donald McGregor were prosecuted and convicted. Milton got 15 years for theft and conspiracy. Donald got 12. The case was closed, solved, finished. Melissa was just another missing person in a city that has swallowed thousands of them. Except she wasn't. Milton Brooks served 11 years of his sentence, released early for good behavior in 1990. He'd been a model prisoner, quiet, compliant, caused no trouble. He completed a degree program in library science while incarcerated, taught literacy classes to other inmates, became the kind of redemption story prison officials loved to cite in budget hearings. When he was released, he moved to New Jersey, worked as a researcher for a small publishing house, lived in a modest apartment in Newark. He told neighbors he'd made mistakes in his past, paid his debt to society, wanted only to live quietly now. And he did live quietly, almost invisibly. He attended a Lutheran church on Sundays, volunteered at a local food bank, kept to himself. If anyone recognized him from the 1979 scandal, they never said so. The art world had moved on to newer scandals, bigger thefts. Milton Brooks became a footnote in museum security training, a cautionary tale told to new curators about the dangers of misplaced trust. Donald McGregor served 9 years, released in 1988. He moved to Florida, disappeared into retirement, died in 2016 of a heart attack. His obituary made no mention of his conviction. Both men took their secrets with them, or so everyone thought. In April of 2021, during the strange, dislocated time of the pandemic, Donald McGregor's son was cleaning out his father's storage unit in Fort Lauderdale. Among the boxes of old business records and personal effects, he found a journal. It was unremarkable to look at. Brown leather, the kind you could buy at any bookstore. But inside, in his father's cramped handwriting, was a confession. Donald had started writing it in 2015, a year before his death. Cancer had been found in his lungs. He'd been told he had months, maybe a year. Faced with mortality, he'd felt the need to record what actually happened, even if he never intended anyone to read it. The journal detailed years of illegal antiquities deals, but it also detailed something else. What happened to Melissa Johnson? According to Donald's account, Milton had figured out who made the anonymous tip within days of his arrest. Donald's secretary, the only other person who could have overheard their conversation. Milton was being held at Rikers Island, but he made a phone call, one of his permitted calls, to someone he described in the journal only as M. Donald didn't know who M was. Milton never told him, but M took care of the problem. Melissa had been abducted leaving her night class at Hunter College on February 14th. She'd been taken to a warehouse in Red Hook, Brooklyn. She'd been killed that same night. Her body had been disposed of in a way that ensured it would never be found. Donald's journal didn't specify how, but he wrote that M had connections with sanitation and industrial disposal. Milton had orchestrated the murder from jail. The anonymous tip had threatened to unravel not just the current theft, but years of smaller dealings Milton had conducted, connections he'd built, a network of illegal activity far more extensive than what prosecutors had charged him with. Melissa Johnson, 22 years old, had been murdered for trying to do the right thing. Donald's son sat in that storage unit in Florida, reading his father's confession, and immediately understood what he had to do. He contacted the FBI. The cold case unit of the New York Police Department received the journal in May of 2021. Detectives began the painstaking work of verification. Could they corroborate Donald McGregor's claims? After 42 years, it seemed nearly impossible. But they had one significant advantage. Milton Brooks was still alive. He was 82 years old now, living in the same Newark apartment he'd occupied for decades. Detectives arrived on a Thursday morning in June. Milton answered the door in a cardigan sweater, glasses perched on his nose, looking like someone's grandfather. They asked him to come to the station to answer questions about the Melissa Johnson case. Milton didn't ask who Melissa Johnson was. That was the first tell. In the interrogation room, detectives laid out what they'd learned from Donald's journal. They watched Milton's face, looking for reaction. For a long time, Milton said nothing. Then he asked for a lawyer. The lawyer advised him not to speak. But Milton, facing the end of his own life, he'd been diagnosed with congestive heart failure earlier that year, seemed to calculate a different set of odds. What did he have to lose now? Prison at 82 looked much like his apartment in Newark, small, quiet, and ending. And perhaps, after 60 years, the weight of the secret had become its own kind of prison. He told them everything. Yes, he'd figured out who made the tip. Yes, he'd called someone from Rikers Island. That someone was Marcus M. Holloway, a connection Milton had cultivated years earlier through his involvement in the underground antiquities trade. Marcus did enforcement work, intimidation, collection, occasional violence when deals went bad. He wasn't someone you called lightly. Milton had told Marcus about the problem. Marcus had said he'd handle it. Milton claimed he didn't ask for details, didn't want to know. He just needed the problem to go away. Detectives asked Milton if he felt remorse. "She shouldn't have made that call," Milton said. Not an answer to the question exactly, but perhaps the only honest thing he'd said in 60 years. Marcus Holloway had died in 1997, killed in an unrelated dispute over a drug territory. He would never face justice for his role in Melissa's murder. But Milton had given detectives another name, a detail he'd learned years later through the criminal network he'd once been part of. Marcus hadn't acted alone. He'd enlisted help from someone who had access, someone who could move through certain spaces without attracting attention. He'd enlisted Milton's brother, Thomas Brooks. Thomas was 76 years old in 2021, living in Queens, working as a building superintendent. He'd had minor brushes with the law over the years, petty theft, assault charges that were dropped, but nothing that suggested he'd been involved in murder. When detectives approached Thomas, his reaction was different from his brother's calculation. Thomas ran. He made it 3 blocks before a patrol car cut him off. In the back seat, handcuffed, he broke down. Not from remorse, from fear. Fear of prison, fear of consequences, fear of the life catching up to him that he'd been running from for 60 years. Thomas gave them details Milton either hadn't known or had chosen not to remember. He confirmed the abduction from Hunter College. He confirmed the warehouse in Red Hook. He confirmed that Melissa had been alive when they took her there, that she'd begged for her life, that she'd promised not to tell anyone else what she knew. And he confirmed that he, not Marcus Holloway, had been the one to kill her. Marcus had provided the location and the disposal method, but Thomas had done the actual killing. Strangulation. Quick, Marcus had said. Make it quick. Thomas claimed he'd been high on cocaine, that Marcus had threatened his own family if he didn't help, that he'd lived with the guilt every day since. The detectives noted these claims in their reports but gave them little weight. Guilt that allows you to live normally for 60 years isn't quite guilt, it's just fear of being caught. The state of New York charged Thomas Brooks, who the media now called Milton Brooks, using Milton's name due to his role as the instigator, with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy. The prosecution had Milton's confession, Donald's journal, Thomas's own admission, and forensic evidence that, while limited after 6 decades, included phone records from Rikers Island showing Milton's call on the date in question. The trial began in March of 2022, nearly 43 years after Melissa's murder. The courtroom was packed. Melissa's family, cousins, a younger brother, friends who'd never forgotten her, filled the front rows. True crime podcasters squeezed into the public gallery, documenting every detail. The art world watched, horrified to have an old scandal resurrected with this devastating new chapter. The defense argued that Thomas had acted under duress, that Marcus Holloway had been the true architect of the murder, that the passage of time made a fair trial impossible. They argued that Thomas, now 76 and in poor health, posed no threat to society. The prosecution presented Melissa Johnson as she'd been, a young woman with dreams, with family who loved her, with a future that had been stolen along with her life. They presented her mother's missing person reports, her desperate search, her death, without answers. They presented Grace Johnson's diary entries, where she'd written every night for years, recording the days since Melissa disappeared, as if keeping count might somehow bring her daughter home. The jury deliberated for 6 hours, guilty on all counts. At sentencing, the judge, a woman in her early 60s who'd been a young prosecutor in Manhattan during the original Hermes head case, addressed Thomas directly. "You didn't just take Melissa Johnson's life," she said. "You took her mother's peace. You took answers from everyone who loved her. You took justice itself and buried it, hoping it would stay buried forever. But some debts come due eventually, no matter how long you run from them." The judge sentenced Thomas Brooks to death by hanging, a sentence that garnered significant media attention, as it's rarely imposed in New York. Capital punishment had been effectively abolished in the state since 2007, but given the particularly heinous nature of the crime and its connection to organized criminal activity, the prosecution had sought the death penalty under special circumstances provisions. Milton Brooks, who had orchestrated the murder but hadn't physically committed it, was charged as an accessory after the fact and conspiracy to commit murder. At 82, with advanced heart disease, he was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. He would die in custody 9 months later, in January of 2023. his obituary a brief paragraph in the Newark Star-Ledger that mentioned his conviction but not the name Melissa Johnson. But this story isn't quite finished, because while Thomas Brooks awaited his appeals and Milton served his final months, investigators were still working on a question that had haunted them since the confession. Where was Melissa Johnson's body? Thomas's description of the industrial disposal had been vague. The warehouse in Red Hook had been demolished in the 1990s. Marcus Holloway had taken his specific knowledge to his grave. It seemed possible that Melissa's remains would never be recovered, that her family would have answers but not closure. Then, in August of 2022, a construction crew breaking ground for a new apartment complex in Red Hook uncovered something unusual, 6 feet down: fragments of human remains, a rusted metal drum, and scraps of fabric that had somehow survived 4 decades underground. Forensic anthropologists worked for months to extract and analyze what they'd found. The remains were fragmentary, damaged by time and chemical exposure, but DNA testing confirmed what everyone hoped and feared. They belonged to Melissa Johnson. She was laid to rest in November of 2022 in a ceremony attended by hundreds. Her younger brother, now 61, spoke about the sister he'd barely remembered but never stopped missing. "She was brave," he said. "She tried to do the right thing in a world that didn't protect people like her for doing right things. But we can honor her now. We can say her name." The Hermes head, meanwhile, remains on display at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in the Greek and Roman gallery on the 2nd floor. A small placard has been added beneath it, installed in early 2023. This sculpture was stolen in 1979 and recovered due to the courage of Melissa Johnson, who lost her life for speaking truth. We remember her. So why does this story matter? Why revisit a crime from 1979, solved in 2021, in a world that produces new horrors every day? Because this isn't really a story about art theft. It's a story about the spaces between what we value and who we protect. The Met in 1979 had elaborate security for its collection: temperature controls, humidity monitors, guards, cameras, protocols. They could tell you the provenance of every piece, the precise conditions needed to preserve it, the insurance value down to the dollar. They could protect objects. But Melissa Johnson, who tried to protect those same objects, who saw theft and chose honesty despite the risks, she had no such security, no protocols to keep her safe, no insurance policy to compensate her family for their loss. This is the uncomfortable truth at the heart of so many stories about art and crime. We build fortresses around beauty but leave human beings exposed. Milton Brooks understood this perfectly. He knew the museum would mobilize enormous resources to recover a stolen sculpture. He also knew that a missing Black woman in New York City in 1979 wouldn't generate the same urgency, the same commitment of institutional power. He was right. For 60 years, he was absolutely right. What changed? Why did the truth finally emerge? Partly luck. Donald's son finding that journal, choosing to turn it over rather than destroy it. Partly persistence. Cold case detectives who refused to let Melissa's disappearance remain unsolved even after decades. Partly Milton's own calculation that confession might grant him something, even if just the relief of speaking truth before death. But also something else, something worth acknowledging. The world changed around this story. The missing persons cases that were once filed away and forgotten are now investigated with new tools, new priorities, new recognition that every disappearance matters. DNA databases, social media awareness, true crime culture that keeps cases alive in public consciousness. All of these created conditions where Melissa's story couldn't stay buried forever. I'm going to end where we began. In that gallery at the Metropolitan Museum, standing before the Hermes head. If you visit it now, you'll see a beautiful thing. Marble worn smooth by 2,000 years, features preserved through time and chance, a face that has watched empires rise and fall. You might marvel at the craftsmanship, the way the sculptor captured both youth and wisdom in the God's expression. But you'll also see that placard, Melissa Johnson's name, a reminder that this object's journey through history included not just ancient craftsmen and wealthy collectors, but also a young woman who chose courage over safety, who paid for that choice with her life. Every object in a museum has a history. Usually, we focus on the artist, the era, the style, the significance. We ask, what does this tell us about the people who made it? Melissa's story asks us to consider another question. What does this tell us about the people who protected it? What does it cost to preserve beauty? And who pays that cost? The Hermes head is priceless, according to the Met's insurance documents, but we know the actual price now. The one paid in blood and silence and a mother's lifetime of searching. We know what it cost to bring it home. Thomas Brooks remains on death row as of this recording, though his appeals continue through the court system. Legal experts suggest the death sentence is unlikely to be carried out given New York's current stance on capital punishment, but the conviction stands. He will spend whatever time he has left behind bars, which seems like justice, though nothing can restore what was taken. The Metropolitan Museum established the Melissa Johnson Memorial Fund in 2023, providing scholarships for young people pursuing careers in museum work, particularly those from communities historically underrepresented in the arts. It's a small thing, perhaps, but it means her name is spoken in that building every year, that her courage is remembered in the same institution that her death protected. And sometimes, late in the evening when the galleries are quiet and the last visitors have gone home, guards walking their rounds past the Hermes head say they feel something, a presence, a weight to the silence that wasn't there before. Maybe it's just the power of suggestion, knowing what happened. Or maybe places remember the prices paid within their walls. Maybe beauty, real beauty, carries its history like a scar, visible if you know how to look. The truth is, we'll never know everything about what happened that night in 1979. The men who could tell us are dead or dying, and secrets have a way of following their keepers to the grave. But we know enough. We know Melissa saw something wrong and spoke up. We know she was punished for it. And we know that 60 years later, the world finally acknowledged what it owed her. Her name, her story, the truth. If you found this story compelling, if Melissa's courage moved you, if the layers of this case drew you in, if you believe stories like this need to be told and remembered, I'd be grateful if you'd hit that subscribe button, not for me, but because every subscription helps stories like Melissa's reach more people, helps ensure that the names we forget aren't forgotten forever. And if you're still here, still listening after all this time, leave a comment. Tell me what struck you about this case. Tell me if you've been to the Met, if you've seen that Hermes head, if you'll look at it differently now. Tell me about the cold cases in your own cities that deserve this kind of attention, this kind of reckoning. Because that's what we owe the Melissa Johnsons of the world: attention, memory, the refusal to let convenience or time erase what happened. Hit that like button if you agree. Subscribe for more deep dives into the stories that shape us, haunt us, and ultimately define what we choose to value. And the next time you're in a museum, standing before something beautiful and ancient and priceless, take a moment. Read the placard. Ask yourself, what's the real story here? What am I not being told? Who protected this and what did it cost them? Because every beautiful thing has a price. The question is whether we're willing to acknowledge who paid it. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. And thank you for making sure Melissa Johnson's name is spoken, remembered, honored. Her story deserved to be told. I'm glad we could tell it together.